What's the hardest thing you've had to forgive, or never could?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I was kicked out of my own family dinner with a text that said, "Only the successful belong here." I did not misread it, I did not imagine it, and it was not some half-joking message meant to be funny. It was a statement, delivered by my own mother, written in the group thread for all to see, and backed by my brother who had probably helped her type it. I stared at it for a moment, letting the words hit me, and then I closed the thread without replying anything more than, "Got it. Enjoy dinner." That was the full exchange. No questions asked, no begging for a seat, no long explanations about my life. Just silence, because by then I had already learned that silence unsettles people more than anger ever does. The thing is, they have been trying to measure my worth with their own ridiculous scoreboard for years. My brother loves to parade around his new job title, my cousin cannot shut up about her house renovation, and my uncle is always dropping names of people he supposedly golfs with who sit on various boards. Every holiday turns into some competition about who has the biggest paycheck, the newest car, or the fanciest vacation photos. I used to try and argue, try and prove I was more than they gave me credit for, but eventually I realized it was a waste of breath. They had already written me into their family story as the one who never quite made it, and they liked that role for me, because it gave them someone to compare themselves against. So when that text came through, instead of crying, I opened my laptop. I ordered some Thai food, set the bag on the table when it arrived, and finished running through the last compliance checklist for the deal I had been quietly structuring for months. It was the kind of deal that does not happen overnight. It had taken late-night calls, back-to-back flights, a lawyer who does not play around, and more patience than I thought I had. I had signed non-disclosures, chased down signatures from people in 3 different states, and turned down smaller offers along the way. By the time that text landed, the final stage was already locked in. Now here is where I admit something that will probably make people argue in the comments. I made a mistake in the way I handled it. Instead of forwarding that cruel text to my attorney or even saving a screenshot for proof of how they treated me, I just swiped it away. I thought to myself, why waste storage space on more of their nonsense? At the time it felt like strength, but looking back, maybe I should have kept it. Because part of me wanted the receipts when they later pretended the whole thing never happened. That is the part where people will either agree with me or say I played it wrong. Anyway, while they were all sitting around clinking glasses and bragging about themselves, I was sitting alone in my apartment eating pad thai straight from the container, finalizing the details that would put me in a very different position within hours. I sent a short message to my attorney to confirm the final notary appointment in the morning. I queued a quiet media note, the kind that does not even list your name directly, just says a deal worth over $120 million was finalized today, and leaves the curious ones to dig deeper. I did not need a spotlight or a headline at that moment. I just needed everything to click into place without interference. The irony was almost funny. They thought they were excluding the unsuccessful one while I was literally securing a deal that would make the nonsense they brag about look like pocket change. But I did not gloat. I did not even tell a friend about it. I just kept my head down and got through the paperwork, because I knew if I let myself slip into excitement too early, I might show my hand before the timing was right. By the time the food container was empty and the contract documents were filed, I felt strangely calm. It was not the kind of triumph people imagine when they picture revenge. It was quieter, sharper, and somehow heavier. Because when you finally prove something in a way that cannot be undone, it is not just about beating them at their game. It is about realizing you never had to play their game in the first place. That night, as I set my phone on silent and let the last emails go out, I thought about how strange life can be. A few years earlier, I might have spent the evening crying, asking myself why I was always the one left out, wondering what was wrong with me. But not this time. This time, I went to bed knowing that in less than 24 hours, their entire narrative about me was going to implode. Not because I screamed or demanded they recognize me, but because the truth was going to be broadcast on national television whether they liked it or not. And here is the part you will want to remember, because it changes everything going forward. Sometimes the loudest move is silence, and sometimes the biggest clapback is just letting the world see what you were building while everyone else was busy mocking you. By sunrise, the story was no longer theirs to control. It was mine. And by the end of the night, someone outside the family was going to put my name exactly where they never wanted to see it. The news did not break immediately after the dinner, which in itself felt almost like fate giving me the space to breathe before everything turned upside down. But by the time the late-night broadcast aired, I was already half asleep on my couch when the anchor's voice cut through the room, and I heard my own name paired with the words, "Finalizing a deal worth over $120 million, followed by footage of me shaking hands inside a glass conference room, smiling in a way that even I barely recognized. My phone lit up like a slot machine the second the segment ended, and for a moment I just sat there watching the screen buzz and flash, because after years of silence, dismissal, and outright disrespect from my own family, there was something almost poetic about them finding out through a television screen rather than from me directly. By the time I picked up the phone, I saw missed calls from my mother, my brother, my uncle, and even a cousin I had not spoken to in years, all stacked on top of each other like some desperate chorus line of voices trying to rewrite what they had said only hours earlier. The irony was so thick I almost laughed out loud, because these were the same people who, less than a day ago, had told me I was not worthy of sitting at their table, and now suddenly I was the headline they wanted to attach themselves to. My brother's text was the most predictable: "We should talk." For words that carried none of the cruelty of the earlier message, none of the smugness of "only the successful belong here," just a panicked attempt to reopen a door he had happily slammed in my face the night before. But while they were scrambling to figure out how to spin this, I was processing something much bigger. A colleague reached out quietly to let me know that 2 days earlier, one of my uncle's golfing friends had apparently called a board member tied to my deal and tried to spook them by implying I was not trustworthy, that my finances were shaky, and that the whole arrangement would blow up if they went through with me. It was exactly the kind of move my family specialized in: back-channel whispers, small cuts delivered by people who pretended to be helpful, and sabotage that always came with just enough distance to give them plausible deniability. I was furious when I heard it, but I also knew better than to blow up in anger. Years of being around them had taught me that the only way to really win against people like that is not with yelling or fighting, but with calm, methodical receipts. So I gathered them. I pulled the call logs, the emails, and the voicemail that contained just enough hints of the interference to make it clear where it had originated. I looped in my attorney immediately, who did not waste time drafting a letter that was both professional and cutting, the kind of letter that makes people sweat without ever using threatening language. The letter was addressed formally to the company, but also marked as a courtesy copy to my uncle. I did not add a single dramatic word myself, just attached the evidence and added one line above my signature: "I am sure this was a misunderstanding." That was it. Nothing else. And I knew that sentence would hit harder than any insult, because it implied I had him cornered, and yet I was still giving him the chance to crawl out quietly if he wanted to. At that point the calls from him started coming in waves, one after another, but I did not pick up. Instead, I routed his number straight to voicemail and set up an auto-reply that said, "Please use email for matters related to my work." That one line probably infuriated him more than if I had shouted in his ear, because it reduced his self-styled authority to the same level as any stranger trying to reach me professionally. It meant he had no special access anymore, no back door to my attention, and if he wanted something, he would have to put it in writing. Meanwhile, my mother switched tactics. She started sending voice notes, the kind dripping with passive-aggressive sweetness, saying things like, "We are so proud of you, and you should have told us sooner. We would have celebrated together," as if she had not personally sent the text telling me I was excluded. My brother leaned on guilt, trying to remind me of favors he claimed to have done for me years earlier, which in reality had been nothing more than him taking credit for things I had managed on my own. And my cousin, the one who had been silent for years, now popped up with a breezy, "Hey, congrats, we should catch up soon," as though this were a high school reunion rather than the same family who had erased me when it suited them. I did not respond to any of them. Not because I was cold or heartless, but because I knew responding too early would let them spin the story into something it was not. They wanted me to rush in, patch things up, and let them pretend they had always supported me, but I refused to give them that easy out. I wanted them to sit with the discomfort for at least a full day, to feel what it was like to be on the outside of something important, because that is the position they had forced me into more times than I could count. That night, I sat alone again, this time not with takeout, but with a glass of water and my attorney on speakerphone, walking through the evidence and the letter we had sent. I felt calm, almost eerily so, because for once I was not the one defending myself against their attacks. I was not begging to be understood. I was not trying to prove my worth at a family table stacked against me. I was holding the receipts, and they were the ones scrambling. And here is the truth that might surprise you. Revenge does not always look like some dramatic explosion or a screaming match in a kitchen. Sometimes it is as quiet as a letter drafted in legal language, a voicemail filter, and a refusal to answer the phone. Sometimes the most devastating move you can make is to act like their chaos no longer deserves your energy. By the end of that 24 hours, I had not spoken a single word to any of them, but I knew the shift had already begun. They had gone from gatekeepers to beggars, from the ones shutting doors to the ones knocking on mine. And I also knew something they did not. Within another day, they were going to need me for something much bigger than a family dinner or a congratulatory phone call. Their carefully curated version of success was about to collide headfirst with a reality that required my cooperation, and I was in no rush to give it away. Because in less than 24 hours, the same people who told me I did not belong were going to be asking me to help save something they cared about even more than their pride. And I was ready. By the time the next day rolled around, the phone calls had slowed down, but the tension had only grown heavier, because I knew with absolute certainty that the shift from angry denial to desperate requests was about to hit, and I was not wrong. Since around noon, my mother finally sent a message that said she wanted a quick family meeting, a phrase that in our family never meant anything simple, since it was code for, "We need something from you, but do not want to admit it directly." I decided to go, not because I suddenly felt charitable, but because I wanted to see just how quickly they would pivot from excluding me to pretending we were partners, and sure enough, when I arrived, my brother was already sitting there looking nervous. My uncle was trying to look detached as though he was doing me a favor, and my mother was playing the role of peacemaker, which she only pulled out when she knew their side was in trouble. They did not waste much time with pleasantries before getting into the real issue, which was that my brother had a refinance pending on one of the family properties, a commercial building that had always been technically tied into the trust that my grandfather had left behind, and because of the way those documents had been written, my signature was legally required on one of the consent forms in order for the lender to approve the deal. For years, my family had treated my name on those papers as nothing more than a formality, something they could wave through with a quick phone call and a promise that it did not really matter. But this time, suddenly, my signature actually mattered. And they were not prepared for me to treat it with the same seriousness they had denied me all along. I listened without interrupting as my brother tried to frame it as something routine, insisting that it was just paperwork and that dragging it out would hurt everyone, but I did not nod along like I used to. Instead, I asked for the full set of updated disclosures, every clause and amendment, and I watched the discomfort grow across their faces when they realized I was not going to just sign without reading. My uncle tried to interject, saying things like, "We can work through the details later," and "No need to get caught up in the fine print," but that only fueled me more, because I had spent my entire life being told that my role was to smile and go along. And this time I was determined to flip the script and use their own system against them. As I sat there with the papers in front of me, I noticed something that had always bothered me, a so-called gift that had been written into the trust years ago when I was much younger, something my mother had pushed as an act of generosity at the time, but which in reality had been a way to keep me indebted, since the gift was structured with conditions that allowed them to hold it over me whenever it suited them. I had never had the leverage to challenge it before, but now, with my signature being the one thing they needed, I finally did. I told them calmly that I was not blocking the refinance, but I would not sign until that gift was formally corrected and acknowledged in writing as a loan that had now been satisfied, with no remaining obligations attached to me. The silence in the room was almost comical, because they were so used to me being the one begging for approval that they did not know how to handle me setting conditions. My brother tried to laugh it off, saying it was just old paperwork, but I kept my tone level and repeated the demand. My mother frowned in that way she does when she knows she has been caught but refuses to admit it directly, and my uncle muttered something about how this was unnecessary drama, but none of them had the courage to outright refuse, because they needed that refinance more than they wanted to keep control over me. Eventually, after a few rounds of half-hearted protest, they agreed to draft the correction letter, and I could see the frustration in their eyes as they realized the power dynamic had shifted completely. For the first time, I was not the one on the defensive. I was not the one explaining myself. I was the one holding the pen that could move everything forward or stop it dead in its tracks, and I intended to use that leverage not for revenge in the petty sense, but for the kind of clean, undeniable justice that leaves no room for them to twist the narrative later. Once I had the corrected letter in hand, I signed the consent form, but I also made it very clear that from now on, any document requiring my signature would receive the same scrutiny, because I was done playing the role of passive participant. They could no longer treat me like a silent box they checked to keep their deals running, because I had proven that I was paying attention and that my cooperation came with terms. I could feel their irritation, but I also knew they would comply, because they had no other option. Walking out of that meeting, I felt a kind of clarity I had not felt in years. For so long, they had convinced me that I was powerless, that I was lucky to even be included, but in reality, the system they had built around themselves required me more than I had ever realized, and all it had taken was one moment of saying no to expose how fragile their power really was. The funny part is that they still believed they could outmaneuver me if they just kept pushing, but what they did not understand was that the game had already changed. I was not operating on their terms anymore, and every time they tried to pull me back into their old patterns, I was going to meet them with receipts, boundaries, and conditions they could not escape. That night, as I looked over the corrected letter and the signed documents, I did not feel guilty or conflicted. I felt steady, as though I had finally stepped into the role I should have taken years ago. They had taught me to read between the lines, to expect manipulation, to always brace for the hidden trap, and in doing so, they had unknowingly trained me to beat them at their own game. And I knew, without any doubt, that this was only the beginning, because in families like mine, one victory never settles the score. It only sets the stage for the next battle, and I was more than ready. When the invitation to the charity gala landed in my inbox with a politely urgent note from the event coordinator asking if I could confirm my attendance before end of day because seating charts were locking and the board wanted to acknowledge community leaders during the program, I understood immediately that the announcement from the night before had already begun to ripple through circles my family spent years trying to impress, which meant that for the first time in a very long time my name was moving through rooms where previously they had positioned themselves as the primary point of contact, the face of the family, the people to thank, and the ones to quote, and that shift, subtle in presentation but seismic in consequence, was already making them nervous, because the same status machine they relied on to define who mattered had started to feed on a narrative that did not center them. By mid-morning, my cousin, who treats public relations like oxygen and never misses an opportunity to attach a talking point to someone else's work, forwarded me a bulleted list labeled "Helpful Language for Press and Gala Remarks," a phrase that would have made me laugh if it did not also make me tired, since the bullets were nothing more than a tidy attempt to fold my deal into a family story about shared values and lifelong support, complete with lines about our family's tradition of entrepreneurship and how we always believed in each other, which was a bold rewriting of reality considering that less than 48 hours earlier I had been told by that same family that I did not qualify for a dinner seat reserved for the successful. And I could feel the familiar tug to correct them, to march into a living room and lay out the truth line by line, but I did not take the bait, because the fastest way to lose the ground I had just gained would be to let them drag me back into a performance where they wrote the script and I supplied the closure. Instead, I wrote a very short reply that said I would not be giving remarks from their draft, and that I would be directing my support through a fund I had already discussed with my partners. And before my cousin could accelerate into her next pitch about optics or alignment or family unity, I called the foundation officer who had helped structure the community component attached to our transaction. A clear-eyed woman who speaks in specifics and does not play status games, and I told her I wanted the scholarship we had discussed to be finalized and funded immediately, with the first tranche dedicated to students who are the first in their families to attend college, with priority for those who have been told in 100 tiny ways that they do not belong. Because I remember that feeling in my bones, and I want the money to move in a way that actually changes trajectories rather than buying tables and empty praise. When she asked about naming, I did not hesitate, because the answer had been sitting with me since the moment things started to turn, and I said I wanted it named in honor of my grandmother, the one person who never tried to make me small to make herself bigger, who taught me to keep receipts without becoming hardened, who slipped me $20 bills and birthday cards when everyone else was doing speeches about discipline, and who used to squeeze my hand under the table when a joke went a little too far and whisper that I did not have to laugh to be loved. And the foundation officer paused long enough for me to picture her nodding on the other end before she said she would handle the paperwork and circulate the announcement language for approval within the hour. And I felt a kind of steady satisfaction that had nothing to do with the family scoreboard and everything to do with putting resources where they actually matter. Predictably, as soon as a board member at the gala posted a link to the news article about my deal along with a line congratulating me on a transformative moment for the city, my mother started texting again in that brittle tone she uses when she is trying to sound warm while her jaw is clenched, asking what I planned to wear and whether I wanted to sit at their table, and if I could send over a few sentences about what our family has learned about resilience, which was so brazen I had to put the phone face down for a minute and breathe, because there are times when the urge to rip off the mask and say everything out loud is almost irresistible, but anger is a currency they understand and know how to use against me, while precision is a language they cannot answer without revealing themselves. So I picked the phone back up and responded with a single line stating that I would not be seated with them and that my support would be acknowledged through the foundation announcement. And then, before the inevitable follow-up arrived, I forwarded the final donation confirmation to the gala chair with a quiet request to ensure that the program listed the scholarship by its chosen name with a brief one-sentence description and no attribution gymnastics. The pushback arrived fast because my cousin tried a new angle and claimed that naming the scholarship after our grandmother without coordinating with the family communications plan would be seen as divisive, which translated to her fear that a clean, unspun gesture would expose the hollow center of their public narrative. And while part of me wanted to explain that honoring a woman who actually loved us without conditions is the opposite of divisive, I decided to let the structure do the talking, since the foundation route meant the gala could either accept the funds as designated or reject them, and no one with any sense rejects money earmarked for students who need it. So I simply thanked her for the feedback and said the paperwork was already complete. That afternoon, the foundation officer sent me the one-page announcement for approval, a few straightforward lines laying out the scholarship's purpose and the name attached to it, and as I read it I thought about how many times my family had turned charity into theater. Not because giving is wrong, but because for them the performance often mattered more than the impact, and I felt a surprising calm wash through me when I realized that, without saying a single accusatory sentence, I had engineered a public moment that corrected the record and redirected the spotlight in a way they could not intercept, because they would have to clap for an action that did not center them, and, in doing so, they would be clapping for a version of our family that never quite included them. When the announcement went live in the early evening and the gala chair replied with an enthusiastic confirmation that the program had been updated and that a brief acknowledgement would be made from the stage, my phone started buzzing again. But this time the messages were different, because along with the predictable flurry from family there were notes from former classmates, past colleagues, and even two people I had mentored years ago who wrote to say that seeing a scholarship named for Someone's grandmother made them feel seen in a way that glossy donor walls never do, and I sat with that for a minute, understanding that revenge is most satisfying when it doubles as repair. When the action that protects you also builds something better for someone else, and when the people who hurt you are forced to watch you choose generosity on your own terms without handing them access to your story. I did not attend the gala that night, not because I was hiding, but because I wanted the gesture to stand without the distraction of my face at a table where small talk would quickly curdle into positioning, so I stayed home, answered exactly none of the family calls, and let the program proceed with my grandmother's name spoken into a microphone she would have found intimidating and delightful in equal measure. And in that quiet, I understood that control is not about noise or proximity, but about choosing outcomes and letting the people who underestimated you learn about them in the same public spaces where they once dismissed you. And just when I thought the day had settled into that steady hum of resolved tension, my attorney forwarded an email thread that made me sit up straight. Because buried in a lender's follow-up on the refinance was a request for a second consent connected to an auxiliary clause no one had mentioned in the meeting, a clause that, if signed without revision, would have tied my name to liabilities I had never agreed to carry, which told me two things at once. First, that the old habits were not gone, but simply rebranded, and second, that the next move had arrived sooner than expected, which meant that before the weekend was over I would have to decide whether to escalate privately with sharper boundaries or to make a public example that would end the game entirely. The weekend arrived with a kind of charged silence that felt heavier than any argument, because the usual family chatter that filled the group thread had gone quiet, and I knew that quiet did not mean peace, but strategy. The kind that always preceded a coordinated push to reel me back into the roles they had written for me. So when the message finally came asking me to host a private sit-down at my place to clear the air, I agreed without hesitation. Not because I trusted them, but because I wanted the confrontation on my terms, in my space, with my documents ready and my boundaries laid out so clearly that there would be no way for them to twist my words into something softer later. By the time they arrived, my kitchen table was already prepared, not with food or drinks, but with a folder that contained every piece of evidence I had quietly collected, because I had learned the hard way that emotions fade in memory, but paper remains. And I was not about to walk into another conversation where their denials outlasted my truth. They walked in with practiced smiles, my mother trying to radiate warmth she did not feel, my brother attempting casual jokes that fell flat, and my uncle leaning on the air of an elder statesman who was there to guide, not to take. But their performance did not move me, and I sat them down quickly, telling them I wanted this to be short and direct, because I had work to do and no patience left for circles. My mother started first, speaking about misunderstandings, about how texts can come across harsher than intended, and about how the family was united in pride for me, but I stopped her mid-sentence and slid the first set of papers across the table. Copies of the emails and call logs that documented my uncle's interference with the board member. I said nothing at first, letting them read, because silence can sometimes be louder than accusation, and I wanted the weight of those words on the page to speak before I did. When my uncle tried to brush it off as exaggeration, I calmly pointed to the letter from my attorney, the one already acknowledged and logged, and then added that the only reason I had not escalated further was because I was willing to treat it as a misunderstanding, but only once. My brother shifted in his chair, clearly realizing that the balance had tipped, but before he could jump in, I laid down the second set of papers, the correction letter they had already signed for the refinance, now legally binding and correcting the old gift that had been used as leverage against me for years. I explained that going forward, every transaction requiring my signature would be treated with the same rigor, not because I wanted conflict, but because I would never again allow my name to be used without full understanding and consent. My mother's face hardened at that point, and she asked if I really intended to put legal walls between myself and my own blood, and I told her directly that I had no choice, because they had already shown me what happened when I allowed blind trust. I said the walls were not punishment but protection, and if they could not live with that, then perhaps what they called family was never more than a network of transactions dressed up as love. The silence that followed was sharp, but I did not soften it because I wanted them to sit in the discomfort of realizing that the leverage they had counted on had evaporated, not through anger, but through structure. Then I pulled out the final page, the one that mattered most, a boundary agreement drafted by my attorney, not complex, not hostile, but simple and enforceable, spelling out that any future requests involving my name, signature, or presence in financial or public matters would have to be submitted in writing, reviewed on my timeline, and approved without pressure. I told them this was not a suggestion but a condition, and if they wanted my cooperation in the future, they would sign it today. My brother opened his mouth to protest, but when I raised the folder again, hinting at the evidence that could still go public if necessary, he shut it quickly, and my uncle, calculating as always, finally picked up the pen. My mother followed reluctantly, her pride swallowing the ink as she scrawled her name across the bottom of the page. When the papers were signed and back in my hands, I stood up, signaling the meeting was over, but before they could leave, I added one more detail that none of them had expected. I told them that the scholarship in our grandmother's name had already been announced at the gala, fully funded and irrevocable, and that the press note would circulate in less than an hour. I explained that the family could choose to embrace it as part of our legacy or ignore it, but they would not be able to rewrite it, redirect it, or bury it under their spin. Because the money was already moving and the credit was already tied to her memory, not theirs. The look on my mother's face when she realized the permanence of that gesture was something I will not forget, a mix of disbelief, anger, and begrudging recognition that I had just pulled off what none of them could undo. They left shortly after, quieter than they had arrived, and for the first time in years I felt no urge to chase after their approval or to question whether I had gone too far, because I knew I had done exactly what needed to be done. I had rewritten the terms of our relationship without raising my voice, without theatrics, and without giving them the satisfaction of a fight they could later twist. I had turned their exclusion into my leverage, their silence into my weapon, and their cruelty into the fuel for something lasting and undeniable. That night, as I sat alone again, I thought about the text that had started it all, only the successful belong here, and how they had meant it as a wound, a line meant to keep me outside. But in the end, it had become the phrase that proved how little they understood about success, because true success is not about sitting at someone else's table waiting for scraps of validation, but about building a table so solid that no one can pull it out from under you. And while I know they will continue to test the boundaries, to search for cracks, and to plot new angles, I also know that the rules have changed forever, because they signed those rules themselves. So when people ask me now what it feels like to finally get revenge, I tell them it is not fireworks or shouting, it is paperwork and patience, it is precision and persistence. And it is the quiet satisfaction of watching people who once dismissed you adjust to the reality that you no longer need their approval because you already won. And in that victory, I did not just claim a seat at their table, I built a room of my own, and I will never again apologize for belonging there.